All right, greetings. Today I want to talk about total depravity and our total accountability, or in light of total depravity or radical corruption, our total sinfulness, how come that along with that we remain fully accountable before God with whom we have to do? All right? So, total depravity and total accountability of fallen men and women and children at this point. So, men and women, human beings in Adam, though radically corrupt, totally sinful, depraved, and all of that, with our minds darkened and our hearts fully depraved and prone to all evil, unable to do any spiritual good, how come that people who drink iniquity as water are still judged by God and held accountable for all of their actions? It's kind of a question that is brought up very frequently by people who do not know the gospel and who get irritated by the message of the sovereign God. And it's a very frequent objection, most common, that people say, well, if God is so sovereign and men are so unable to do any spiritual good, how come that God is still holding them accountable? And I prefer the word accountable rather than responsible. People sometimes say, well, you're responsible for this, you're responsible. Even go as far as to say they're responsible for keeping their salvation, or responsible partly for their salvation. Well, men are not responsible for their salvation. Salvation is wholly the work of God alone, by grace alone, through faith alone, by Christ Jesus alone, to the glory of God alone. Men are not capable of either initiating nor finishing their salvation. So men are not responsible. Nevertheless, there is such a thing as an accountability before God. And it's interesting that this question is so oftentimes raised, by people. Say, well, if, again, if God is fully sovereign as you say he is, and men are so corrupt, if no one doeth any good and no one is righteous and dead in trespasses, how come that we're still accountable, that God is still holding us accountable? That's a huge question. And it's interesting that in the book of Romans, there's at least twice that this question surfaces in the words of Paul's unseen interlocutors or opponents who try to oppose his view. In this famous epistle in chapter 3, Paul kind of foresees this objection. He says that that if our unrighteousness, in verse 5, demonstrates the righteousness of God. I'm reading, by the way, from New King James, not the actual King James, but New King James is somewhat more modern, updated, and so. But if our unrighteousness demonstrates the righteousness of God, what shall we say? Is God unjust, who inflicts wrath? I speak as a man? Certainly not. For then how will God judge the world? See, this is what's happening. It says that our unfaithfulness and our unrighteousness actually serves to contrast and the faithfulness, fidelity of God and his righteousness. If it demonstrates, if it serves to kind of contrast and against the backdrop of our unfaithfulness, God appears exceedingly faithful. And our unbelief, our unfaithfulness does not make the faithfulness of God of no effect. If God uses even our sinfulness, again, to show forth his righteousness, his holiness, his faithfulness, then why would God then be unjust to inflict wrath? And it says, by no means, says Paul, for then how will God judge the world? So the foundation, God must have the foundation for judgment. Okay? God uses even unjust, nations and individuals to achieve his own holy ends and purposes in history. Undoubtedly, he used a sinful, lawless man to crucify the Lord of glory. By the hands of the wicked man, he accomplished so great a redemption or salvation. Nevertheless, those who actually committed that most heinous act in the entire history of humankind, when they put to death the most innocent, the truly innocent man, Jesus Christ, they were still held accountable for this deed. As you know, that Judas, who betrayed the innocent blood, was still held accountable, even though of him it is said that he was a son of perdition, and that was his foreordination. He was a chosen vessel of wrath. And Romans 9 speaks of Pharaoh as I raised thee up for this very purpose, to demonstrate the power, the full display of his righteous wrath and indignation against the Pharaoh. And then, so well, if who resists his will? So we go to the next passage, which again speaks about this justice of God. How can God be just in punishing sin, even though there are vessels of wrath who are just fitted for that very purpose? And no one has resisted God's will, but how come that he's still judging people? How can be, is therefore an unrighteousness with God? Let's go, let's look at this passage briefly, shall we? He says that, so then, verse 16 of Romans 9, so then it is not of him who wills, nor of him who runs, but of God who shows mercy. For the scripture says to Pharaoh, for this very purpose I've raised you up, that I may show my power in you, and that my name be declared in all the earth. Therefore he has mercy on whom he wills, and whom he wills he hardens. Now, this is the clearest, most perspicuous statement of God's absolute, immense, and awful, majestic sovereignty. Absolute sovereignty over all things, and he has mercy upon whom he has mercy, and his prerogative, his divine right, and whom he wills he hardens. It's not of you, it is not of the creature. He determines. It is entirely of his good pleasure. It is not conditioned upon anything in those creatures. In point of fact, he proceeds. But it's interesting. His interlocutor says that, well, you will say to me then, how does he still find fault? For who has resisted his will? And again, I remind you that if Paul was Arminian or semi-Pelagian, he would say, well, no, look, God's will does not embrace the free will of man, that God is a gentleman. He willingly sets limits to his sovereignty so as not to force people, because he endowed us with free will. Therefore, you're not right to say that who is resisting his will, because that's just, it's outside of the realm of his, because we have sovereignty over our will. Our will is free, therefore we do as we please and so forth. First of all, Paul does not say anything of the sort. He agrees, in point of fact, that no one can stay his hand and say to him, what dost thou? So no one has resisted God's will. But why does he still find fault? And it's note as well that Paul is not an infralapsarian. Infralapsarianism teaches that God his first decree was of all eternity to create and then to permit the fall. And then at the backdrop, and only foreseeing this common fall of the whole mankind, God chooses some unto salvation, and he chooses to bypass or pass over the rest of the mankind and to leave them in that misery into which they willingly plunge themselves. This is infralapsarianism. So at the backdrop of the already committed sin, at the backdrop of the fall, he elects some. The common, very common picture of Calvinism as electing some as a result at the backdrop of their sin. But it's interesting, Paul is not appealing, he is not counteracting this argument. Why does he still find fault? Who is resisting his will? He is not saying, who art thou, or sinner? Who art thou, or sinner, that replies against God? He's not saying, look, we're all sinners, therefore God would have been entirely just to leave us all in the common misery. But out of his mercy, he has elected someone to salvation. Paul is not saying that. Paul is not infralapsarian. He says, but indeed, O man, who are you to reply again? Who are you, man? He is appealing to manhood, creaturehood as such. He says, who are you, man? Who are you? You're just the dust, a speck of dust. All of the nations are as nothing, as the dust, as the drop of the bucket. They're all lighter than air on the balance of God. All of the nations are just as nothing. Isaiah says repeatedly. So Paul says, who are you, man, to talk back to God? Will the thing formed to say to him who formed it, why have you formed it like this? Say, look, God has all the right. He is the divine potter, we're just the clay. Does he not have the right, being who he is, the divine creator, and we're just creatures, to do as he pleases with creatures? So Paul is not infralapsarian, he is supralapsarian. He says, look, you're just the creature. God has all the right to do as he pleases with his vessels, with this clay, out of the same lump of clay, to make some vessels unto honor and unto dishonor, vessels of wrath and vessels of mercy. It is just his right. This is the argument of Paul in a nutshell in the following verses from here in the book of Romans. But it's interesting that the very fact that twice in this letter we see the same questions. Why does he still find fault? If our unrighteousness demonstrates God's righteousness, why would he still find fault with us and inflict wrath? Paul says, look, how would he judge the world? So he needs to hold a man accountable. And here in Romans 9, he says, that, who are you, man, to talk against God? And he's not even talking about sinfulness per se. He's talking about our being creatures that we have no right to rise up to, shake our fists in the face of the Creator, who does with his creation as he pleases. Now, this is one thing which is very apparent, very much on the surface, but there's another thing to it, that, remember the thesis that men are totally depraved, as I titled this message. We're totally depraved, an Adam, by nature. We're totally depraved, radically corrupt, and so forth, and yet we're fully accountable. And it's pretty, it doesn't sit well with us. People revolt and say, well, if we're just disposed to all evil, if we're prone to, if we're not capable of doing anything good, if we're sinned because we're sinners, not we become sinners because of sin. No, we are sinners, and therefore we sin. We drink iniquity as water. How can we still be held accountable? Now, and here's my point for today. Remember, if we look at the faculties of man, when man became affected, we talk about noetic influences of sin, the radical corruption, how sin has defaced the imago Dei, the image of God in man, how man became depraved in their desires, in their minds. Their minds became darkened, their wills became depraved, and their affections are evil. So man, if we look at these three faculties, the affections of the heart, the understanding became fools. The fool says in his heart there is no God, so became fools. The desires are wicked, and the wills are also corrupt. If we'll take these three aspects. Men, on the other hand, like to talk about the will being free. This is the common delusion and very common, very culpable, damnable delusion that people think that the will is free. And people rather will admit that the minds of darkness say, well, we don't know better, okay? We don't know that we're agnostics. We don't know if there's a God and so forth because it's not clear. We can't see God and so forth. Therefore, we're excused in our ignorance. But the will is free. So the way of man is to exonerate themselves. They say, well, we just don't know any better. But they also emphasize that the will is free, as though intact by sin. The Arminians, of course, follow in that direction. They're saying, well, the will is free. We're endowed with a free will. Yes, we're prone to evil and so forth. We're sick with sin, but nevertheless, there's this part of the will. We can still determine the will to a better path and choose the good side, the good thing, and freely choose Christ and follow Him. And so all of the Armenian diagrams work that way, that God has done His part. Now He's stretching forth His hand, He's offering His medicine, which will make you well, but it's still up to you to open your mouth or to also stretch forth your hand to take that saving medicine. And then in this cooperation, God did the most part, and you'll do your little part, but without your part, you're not going to be saved. This synergism. So in this suggesting that the will is not corrupt, but the will is enslaved by sin. So those who sin, they're slaves to sin. And as we know that we all sin universally and continuously. And Jesus says that whosoever doeth sin is a slave to it. And we're slaves to sin. This is very much part of that revelation in the Bible, our woeful condition that we're bondservants of sin. Okay, that's established. Now, if the will is corrupt, well, what about this knowledge? And here, I would insist that even though men have become fools and our minds are darkened by sin, and man, because of the fall, have actually grown stupid in many regards, and they're even the most intelligent with extremely high IQ scientists. So for when they speak about God, they just spout nonsense. And we rightly hold those statements as just stupid hot air. So people have become fools. Nevertheless, there's some knowledge which makes them the right subjects of God's judgment as being accountable. So the ability in man to perform that which is good is not necessary to continue to hold them fully accountable for their actions. But their knowledge, or remains rather, of knowledge of what is good and what is evil, those things make a person a right object of God's exacting justice. Okay, let's go to Romans 1 to show you what I mean. Remember when Paul begins to develop and explain the unrighteousness of man, he begins from starting from verse 18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of man, who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Now this is New King James, as I remind you, not the King James. The King James hold the truth unrighteous. Here it says, who suppress the truth. It's more literal. That's what they do. And it's interesting that man suppress the truth in unrighteousness. So they try to press it down. The picture is here as though it is a mighty spring that wants to spring back up, and man are trying to suppress, to hold it down, to press it down in unrighteousness. Okay, it's a deliberate action. It is something that men do because they know the truth and they want to keep it down. They want to suppress it in unrighteousness. And he explains, Paul does, because what may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them, or in them, more literally. So there is such a thing as innate knowledge of God. Because, again, he says, for since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they're without excuse. Okay? So I don't want to spend too much time. It comes with a pretty basic knowledge and the apologetics of Paul's way of dealing with the manner without excuse. What can be known of God is clearly seen in the creation, in the outside creation, that the very fingerprints, as it were, of God's majesty, of his eternal power and wisdom of a creator are displayed in all of the beauty and majesty of the created world. And also the knowledge of man as such, because we as creatures, we're talking about man and woman, humankind, a phenomena is totally inexplicable outside of the creator, who is at least as intelligent, because it would have been, just the phenomena of our existence, of our thoughts, of our aspirations, of our quest for the meaning, for the purpose in life. It would have been totally meaningless if we're just reduced to highly developed animals. Well, the animals, we just, you just want to eat and just replicate, reproduce, that's all. Why should you be bothered with such things as justice, as the purpose in life, and aspirations, and all of that? That in itself bears witness to the Creator, who's created man after his image, after his likeness, and so on. So what may be known of God is manifest in them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen. And because, verse 21, although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools. And here we have this spiral of this further and further fallen away, the great apostasy, which began in the garden. But it's the idolatry, and therefore God gave him over. He gave him up to uncleanness, to the lust of their heart, to dishonor their bodies among themselves, and so on. And we see that even the sin of sodomy, all this abomination, they exchanged the natural use, living the natural use of the use of man. First of all, it's the women. Even though women exchange the natural use for what is against nature, likewise also men. All of this lesbian, LGBT stuff is already a sign of judgment. God gave him over, gave him up to unclean passions and all of that. But it's interesting. So, and then follows the description of what men and women and children are in their current state. Under sin, corrupt, evil, prone to all evil, and so with all unrighteousness, sexual immorality, wickedness, covetousness, the whole description. And at the end of that chapter, verse 32, he says, who, knowing the righteous judgment of God, that those who practice such things are deserving of death, not only do the same, but also approve or find pleasure, King James, in them that practice them. Now, this is interesting. They know the righteous, those who do such things, they know the righteous judgment of God, that those who practice such things are deserving of death, but not only do the same, but also approve of those who practice them. What does it say to us? So all of this current repulsive insanity and the aggressive pushing forward of this the so-called LGBT sodomite agenda and so forth, it's just exactly, it's the proof of the truth of this statement. They not only practice, but they find pleasure. They approve those who practice them. Why are they doing that? Well, because like in the building of the Tower of Babel, to build this foundation, it's not just us, it's not just me. There are many of us, okay? So to legitimize this revolt, okay, this cosmic treason against God, they want to replicate make as many followers of this wicked and abominable way. That's why Sodom is so aggressive, because they want to prove those who practice them, because then you will have a multitude. They'll say, well, it's not just me. See, it's how widespread such a thing is. Again, it's reminiscent of the Tower of Babel. They came together, let's build on it before we be scattered, so that at least we'll erect our own glory. Okay, something that we've achieved collectively. Okay, so this collective guilt, it's this herd instinct of man that I'm not alone in this abomination. There are so many of us. Therefore, it's a month of pride and so forth. They parade. They want to recruit more. They approve of those who practice them. But it's not just the sodomite. I mean, the whole thing, the whole revolt, it involves recruiting more people. But the next thing, or rather the first thing that says, they know the righteous judgment of God. Even though they suppress the truth and unrighteousness, it says, verse 18, they suppress the truth, they're holding on unrighteousness. Nevertheless, it's something that is still kind of trying to spring back up inside of them, and they know it. Paul emphasizes. Some people say, see, the fall did take place in the garden. Men became fools, and they say, look, so many generations have been raised up as atheists and so forth, and we'd rather acknowledge our ignorance. They'll say, well, we're agnostics. We don't know whether there's life after death. We don't have enough data on it, so we can be excused because we just don't know. Our will is still good. We're still good people inside, but we don't know. You can't say that we all know that there's a God. Well, not according to Paul. Paul says that they know, even they know the judgment. And that's actually what he explains in the next chapter, in chapter 2, when even the heathen, the Gentiles, who do not have the written revelation, nevertheless they have the so-called works of the law written upon their hearts. Therefore their thoughts sometimes excuse them, sometimes accusing them. So they have this conflict. And all men and women universally want to be treated fairly as to themselves. Well, this is not fair, this is not right, and so forth. Everybody talks about their rights and being treated fair. Now, if you're just the highly developed animals, why would you care about such things as justice, equality, and stuff like that? If it's just the survival of the fittest, forget about it. Just do your thing, chase you, and survival of the fittest. That's all there is to it. But they know the righteous judgment of God, that those who practice such things deserve death. So they realize that they ought to do good. Now, they don't have the full revelation. They don't have the Torah. They don't have the Old Testament, the general mankind. But there's this revelation. They still know that there is a God. He's immense. He is the creator of all things. He's majestic in power and glory and so forth. He is in the beginning, and he has no beginning. He is the first cause of all things. He's created them. And he is a righteous God, because the very glimpses of what is right, what is good, that we still possess, even though we try to mar that and to cover it with our habitual sins and vices, nevertheless we still retain this original knowledge, and it's still present. Therefore, Paul says in the present that they know the righteous judgment of God, that those who practice such things deserve death. They don't all do them, but they also find pleasure or approve those who practice them, because they want to be hiding in the multitude. It's not just me. There are many of us who think the same. This is the rotten strategy of fallen man. And therefore, they show themselves as guilty. They do have this guilt. So, and the guilt presupposes some knowledge. Why would else people experience this guilt? They know, we all know, we're not doing what is right. We all have conscience, which bites us. Sometimes I'm being eaten alive by conscience. We know. Even according to our very much lowered standards, we're not doing all that we ought to be doing. And even though we're still, being developed, well, I'll try better. I'll try to be a better person. And popular religion encourages, yeah, be a better person. It's all about transformation. So you can do better than that. And Jesus is ready to help you. And all the religion will help you further on. So you'll be polished persons and so forth. Well, it's a lie. It comes from the pit of hell. But the point is that men do have this knowledge. And therefore, because they know the righteous judgment, therefore they're held accountable. The ability is not the issue. See, Armenians make this mistake, well, because God commands certain things, well, therefore men must be able to perform that which is commanded. Otherwise, why would God give laws and his holy law, knowing full well that no one actually keeps it? No, that ain't the answer. The answer is that man, even though starting from the garden, knowing good and evil. Let's talk about that for a second. When they ate of that tree, they did not become brighter intellectually. The very fact of their eating of that forbidden tree did not raise their IQ. So when God says, well, man has become as one of us, knowing good and evil, it doesn't mean that, oh boy, they've become so intellectually acute because of that sinful act. No, what it means is that they usurped the right to discern what is right and what is good for themselves. Man became autonomous. If you will, they attained to that free will notion in the garden. We will choose for ourselves what is good and what is evil. We ourselves, thank you, Lord, because this tree, it looks so good. You say not to eat of it, even though it appears so good and pleasant and good, and we'll have it our way. So here you have the so-called free will, knowing good and evil for themselves, deciding what is good and evil. But the point is that man knows things that are expected of him, and in the law of conscience, this universal notion of equity, of justice, of everybody wants to be treated fairly. We're not necessarily fair to other people, and we're selectively fair to those whom it is profitable in some ways, or we want to show, and so forth. We're very wicked and very inventive in that regard, but we certainly, all of us, we want to be treated well. And we're very unhappy if somebody steps over our ego, if somebody impugns, trespasses our inalienable rights and so forth. Everybody wants their rights and so forth. So we have that knowledge. And because of that, because we're still moral agents who have rational minds and souls and hearts, our hearts desire wicked things. We lust and so forth. Our wills are corrupt. But we do know that we're supposed to be doing good, even based on that first chapter of the book of Romans. Even though it's stated here negatively, in the sense that who, knowing the righteous judgment of God, that those who practice such things are deserving of death. Therefore, what is the implication? You oughtn't to be doing it, right? If things that you're doing, all this, abomination, all this LGBT stuff, it is worthy of death, and so you shouldn't be doing all those things. It's an abomination. And not only do those things, but they also approve of those who practice them. And therefore, since they retain this knowledge, it's not a saving knowledge, but this knowledge is enough to condemn them. Because of that, men and women and children are still held accountable, fully accountable for their actions. The ability is not the issue. The knowledge is. Men still have that knowledge. That's the point that I wanted to make. So men can be, and in fact are, totally depraved and still totally accountable. So the Pharaoh, even though he was the vessel of wrath and so forth, nevertheless, he knew he oughtn't have been fighting against God, hardening his heart, though it was the result of God's hardening. Nevertheless, he knew he ought to have done better than that, yet he continued. Therefore, his sin remained on him. So this is the teaching I wanted to give in this regard. So may God bless you all, and I would remind you that if any of you find the teaching somewhat helpful and so forth, I would encourage you to pray for me, for my ministry. If you want to contribute, you can find me at Grace Alone at yandex.ru, and that's my PayPal. If you want to contribute, I mean, easy to talk about these things, but my ministry largely is dependent upon believers contributing and supporting what I'm doing. So if you would consider that I would appreciate that. Well, may God bless you all, and see you next time.